1 minute ago, inside palace walls, a silent coup just blindsided Queen Camilla. Princess Anne has officially aligned with Prince William in what insiders are calling the most devastating Diana-related bombshell in decades. Camilla never saw this alliance coming, and the heavy wheels of justice just set in motion cannot be undone. What did Anne and William just do to avenge Diana's memory? Let's look at the palace papers. The move that changed everything.
My mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC.
There are moments in the life of an institution that arrive without announcement. Moments that do not come with press releases or carefully managed briefings or the usual apparatus of palace communications deployed to shape public perception before the story takes hold. They simply happen. And by the time the people most affected by them understand the full weight of what has occurred, the ground has already shifted permanently beneath their feet. What Princess Anne and Prince William did in the second week of February 2026 was one of those moments. And the reason it has sent shockwaves through the palace, in a way that very few internal developments have managed in recent memory, is not simply what they did, it is what it represents, what it connects to, and what it signals about the direction this family is, finally, after decades of careful avoidance, prepared to move in. The action itself began with a document, not a press statement, not a public declaration. A formal internal submission to the Royal Household Trust Authority, the body responsible for overseeing the management and preservation of the monarchy's most sensitive historical records and personal archives. The submission was filed jointly. Both Anne's name and William's name appeared on it, and what it requested was something that had never been formally requested before in the history of that body. It requested the formal review, preservation, and controlled public release of a specific collection of private correspondence, letters, notes, and recorded communications connected to the period between 1985 and 1997. The years that defined, and ultimately destroyed, Diana's life inside the royal family. The submission did not use Diana's name explicitly in its opening clauses. It referenced the correspondence by archive classification number and described it in the formal language of institutional record management. But everyone inside the Royal Household Trust Authority who received it understood immediately and completely what was being requested and why. The classification numbers corresponded to materials that had been sealed, protected, and in some cases, actively suppressed for nearly 3 decades. Materials that, if released in the controlled manner Anne and William were proposing, would place on the public record a documented account of what Diana experienced during those years that went considerably further than anything previously acknowledged by the institution. The submission landed on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 senior courtiers had been informed. By Thursday, the information had reached Camilla's office. And by Friday, sources confirm, Camilla had convened an emergency meeting with her legal advisor and her most senior communications aide to assess what she was dealing with and what options were available to her. The answer to that second question was less reassuring than she had hoped, because Anne and William had not acted impulsively. They had not reached for this particular mechanism in a moment of frustration or emotional reaction. They had prepared their submission with the kind of methodical care that transforms a request into something very close to an inevitability. Every procedural requirement had been met. Every relevant legal framework had been addressed. Every potential objection had been anticipated and answered within the body of the submission itself. It was, in the assessment of a senior legal advisor who reviewed it on behalf of the household, close to airtight. The grounds for refusal were narrow. The grounds for delay were manageable, but not indefinite. And the public interest argument that Anne and William had constructed around the release of the materials was strong enough to survive serious scrutiny. Camilla's legal team identified 3 possible lines of challenge. All 3 were assessed as unlikely to succeed in the long term. They might slow the process. They would not stop it. Now step back for a moment and consider what this actually means, because the significance of what Anne and William have done operates on 2 levels simultaneously. The first is procedural. They have set in motion a formal institutional process that, if it reaches its conclusion, will place documented historical material about Diana's years inside the royal family into the public record in a way that the palace has spent decades preventing. The second level is personal. And it is the personal level that explains why Camilla is reeling in a way that goes beyond the legal and institutional concerns her team has been assessing since Thursday. Because the correspondence being sought for review covers the period during which Charles's relationship with Camilla was at its most active and most damaging to Diana. The period during which Diana was, by her own account and the accounts of multiple people close to her, experiencing a level of emotional suffering inside her marriage that the palace chose to manage through suppression rather than address through genuine support. The materials Anne and William are seeking to place on the public record would not simply tell Diana's story. They would tell it with documentary evidence, with letters and notes and recorded communications that put specific words, specific dates, and specific institutional decisions on the record in a way that personal testimony, however compelling, never fully achieves. That is what Camilla is sitting with, not the abstract possibility of historical re-examination, the concrete reality of documented evidence about a specific period of her life, and her relationship with Charles being formally reviewed by an institutional body with the authority to release it. And the people who filed the submission requesting that review were not palace outsiders or media opponents or political adversaries. They were the king's own sister and the king's own son, acting together, formally, on the record. That combination, Anne and William moving in the same direction at the same moment through official institutional channels, is something the palace has not seen before. And understanding why it happened now, why these two particular people chose this particular moment to act, requires going back to something that has never fully gone away inside this family. It requires going back to Diana, and to everything that was done to her that was never fully accounted for. That is exactly where we are going next. And what emerges when you look at it carefully is more significant than most people outside the palace currently understand. The Diana connection and why it still matters. Diana Spencer married into the British royal family on the 29th of July, 1981. The wedding was watched by 750 million people around the world. It was described at the time as a fairy tale, a young, beautiful, largely unknown woman stepping into the most storied royal household on earth and taking her place beside the man who would one day be king. What happened to her inside that institution over the following 16 years is a matter of historical record, but it is a record that has never been complete. And the incompleteness of that record is not accidental. It is the result of decades of deliberate institutional management designed to ensure that the full documented picture of Diana's experience inside the royal family remained inaccessible to the public and to history. That management began while Diana was still alive. It accelerated after her death in Paris in August 1997. And it has continued, in various forms, through every subsequent decade in which the palace has had reason to protect the people and the decisions that caused her the most damage. William was 15 years old when his mother died. He has spoken, in careful and measured terms, about the impact of that loss on multiple occasions over the years that followed. He has described the grief. He has described the public nature of the mourning and the private nature of his own experience of it. He has talked about carrying his mother's memory as both a privilege and a weight. What he has not talked about publicly, what he has never discussed in any interview or official statement, is the specific knowledge he carries about what Diana experienced inside her marriage and inside the institution that was supposed to protect her, the specific things he saw, the specific things he was told, the specific understanding he developed as he grew from a grieving 15-year-old into a man preparing to lead the monarchy his mother suffered inside, of what had actually happened and why. But those close to him say that knowledge has never left him, that it has shaped his view of Camilla from the very beginning, that it has informed every decision he has made about the boundaries of acceptable behavior inside the household he is preparing to lead, and that it has been accumulating, quietly and steadily, into something that was always going to find expression at some point. Princess Anne's connection to this story is less immediately obvious, but in some ways more significant, because Anne was not a peripheral figure during the years the correspondence covers. She was a senior member of the royal family, navigating the same institutional landscape that Diana found so devastating. She witnessed from inside the family the dynamics that were destroying her sister-in-law. She had her own views about what was happening, her own assessments of the decisions being made and the people making them. She also had access, not to everything, but to enough. Enough to understand, with a specificity that very few people outside the immediate family circle could match, what the correspondence being sought for review actually contains and why its release matters. Sources close to Anne describe a woman who has carried a particular kind of private knowledge about the Diana years for a very long time. Knowledge that she has never brought into the public domain. Knowledge that she has maintained in the careful silence that has always characterized her approach to the most sensitive family matters. But knowledge that has shaped her private assessment of Camilla's position inside the family in ways that have never been fully visible from the outside. The correspondence itself, the materials Anne and William have formally requested for review, covers several distinct categories. The first involves communications between senior palace officials and medical and psychological advisors connected to Diana's care during the period when her mental health was deteriorating most seriously inside the marriage. These communications, sources familiar with their content suggest, document institutional awareness of Diana's condition and institutional decisions about how to respond to it that do not reflect well on the people who made those decisions. The second category involves communications between Charles and his private office during the same period. Communications that document, in his own words, and the words of his most senior advisors, his awareness of Diana's suffering and the choices he made about how to address or not address it. These are not secondary accounts or reported characterizations. They are primary documents, words written at the time by the people who were there. The third category is the most sensitive and the most directly relevant to Camilla's current position. It involves communications that document the extent of Charles and Camilla's relationship during the years when Diana was still married to Charles and still living inside the royal household. Not in the general terms that have been publicly acknowledged for decades, in specific terms, specific dates, specific communications, specific evidence of the degree to which that relationship was known to, and in some cases actively facilitated by, senior figures inside the palace. That third category is what has Camilla most concerned, because the public narrative around Charles and Camilla's relationship has, over the years since their marriage in 2005, been carefully shaped toward a particular framing. The framing of two people who loved each other for a long time, who made mistakes, who caused pain, but who ultimately found their way to a legitimate and publicly accepted union. That framing has been accepted, with varying degrees of reluctance, by enough of the British public to allow Camilla to build the position of relative stability and even genuine warmth that she now occupies as Queen Consort. The documented evidence contained in the third category of correspondence, if released, would not simply complicate that framing. It would, sources familiar with the material suggest, fundamentally challenge it, not by introducing new facts that are entirely unknown, but by placing on the permanent public record a level of specific, dated, institutional documentation about what happened and who knew what and when that the current accepted narrative cannot fully absorb. That is the thing about documentary evidence that distinguishes it from personal testimony, however credible. Personal testimony can be questioned, contextualized, disputed. A letter written on a specific date by a specific person using specific words is considerably harder to argue with. And the correspondence Anne and William are seeking to place under formal institutional review contains, by the account of those familiar with it, a considerable volume of exactly that kind of primary documentary material. William understands this. He has understood it for a long time. The question that those close to him have been asking for years is not whether he would ever act on that understanding, but when and how. And the answer, it turns out, was February 2026. Through a formal institutional submission filed jointly with his aunt, through official channels, with procedural precision that makes it very difficult to dismiss or deflect. Anne's decision to join him in that submission is the element that elevates this from a significant development to a genuinely historic one, because Anne does not act from sentiment. She does not make institutional moves based on personal grievance or emotional impulse. She acts when she has assessed a situation thoroughly and concluded that the institutional case for action is strong enough to justify the consequences. Her assessment, sources confirm, is that the institutional case for placing this correspondence on the public record is not just strong. It is, at this particular moment in the monarchy's history, necessary. That an institution attempting to rebuild public trust after years of scandal and opacity cannot continue to suppress documented historical material about one of the most significant and most damaging chapters in its recent history. That transparency, however uncomfortable, serves the monarchy's long-term credibility in a way that continued suppression does not. That is the argument at the heart of the submission, and it is an argument that Camilla's legal team is finding very difficult to answer on its merits. What it is doing to Camilla personally, and what it is doing to Charles, who finds himself once again at the intersection of his past and his present in the most painful possible way, is what we are examining next. Camilla's exposure and the palace in crisis. There is a specific kind of vulnerability that comes from knowing that the documented record of your past is about to be examined by people with the authority to make it public. It is different from the vulnerability of personal accusation or media speculation. Those things can be denied. They can be contextualized. They can be managed through the careful deployment of counter-narrative and strategic communication. Documentary evidence is different. It sits there. It does not change. It does not respond to spin. And the knowledge that it exists, that it is being formally reviewed, and that the people conducting that review have both the authority and the stated intention to release it in a controlled and permanent form, produces a particular quality of exposure that is very difficult to manage from the inside. That is where Camilla finds herself in the weeks following Anne and William's submission to the Royal Household Trust Authority. And sources close to the household describe her current state not as the composed, strategic response of someone who has navigated difficult situations before and knows how to find her footing. They describe something rawer than that, something closer to the exposure of a person who has spent 20 years carefully constructing a public position and is now watching the foundations of that position be examined in a way she cannot control. Her legal team has been working intensively since the submission became known to her office. They have identified, as noted previously, 3 possible lines of challenge. The first involves questioning the procedural basis of the joint submission, arguing that certain technical requirements of the Royal Household Trust Authority's review process were not fully met. Legal advisors who have reviewed the submission independently describe this challenge as unlikely to succeed. Anne and William were too careful. The procedural groundwork was too thorough. The second line of challenge involves arguing that the release of the correspondence would constitute an unacceptable invasion of the privacy of living individuals, specifically Charles, whose communications form a significant part of the materials under review. This argument has more substance. Privacy protections for living individuals are real and legally enforceable in certain contexts, but the counter-argument, that the public interest in a documented historical record of decisions made by a senior member of the royal family about matters of significant public consequence outweighs those privacy protections, is strong, and it is an argument that Anne and William have addressed directly and in considerable detail within the body of their submission. The third line of challenge is the most personally uncomfortable for Camilla to pursue. It involves arguing that the specific category of correspondence relating to Charles and Camilla's relationship during the Diana years should be excluded from any release on the grounds that it relates to private personal matters, rather than institutional decisions. The difficulty with this argument is that the line between private personal matters and institutional decisions is, in the context of a marriage between the heir to the throne and a senior princess, essentially impossible to draw cleanly. The relationship between Charles and Camilla during those years was not simply a private personal matter. It had direct institutional consequences. It shaped institutional decisions. It affected the way the palace managed Diana's situation. And the correspondence reflects all of that interconnection in ways that make a clean separation between the personal and the institutional legally very difficult to sustain. Camilla's advisors know this, and the knowledge that their strongest available arguments are unlikely to succeed has produced, sources confirm, an atmosphere inside her immediate circle that is more anxious and more unsettled than anything they have experienced since the early years after Charles and Camilla's marriage, when public hostility toward her was at its most intense and her position inside the family was at its most precarious. Charles is at the center of this crisis in a way that is both obvious and deeply painful. The correspondence under review is, in significant part, his correspondence, his words, his decisions, his documented awareness of what was happening to Diana and the choices he made in response. He cannot be a neutral observer of a process that places his own private communications under formal institutional scrutiny. and he cannot, as king, simply instruct the Royal Household Trust Authority to halt its review. The body operates with a degree of institutional independence that was specifically designed to prevent exactly that kind of royal interference in the management of sensitive historical records. He is, in the most precise sense of the phrase, caught in the middle, between his wife, whose position is directly threatened by what the review may release, between his son, who filed the submission that initiated the review and who represents the future of the institution Charles has given his life to, between his sister, whose judgment he has trusted and respected for decades, and who has placed her name alongside William's on a document that Charles cannot simply dismiss or override, and between his own past and his present, which the review process is in the act of forcing into direct and documented confrontation. Sources close to Charles describe a man whose private response to the situation is considerably more complex than his public silence suggests. He understands at some level why William has done this. He has understood for years that the Diana question was never fully resolved inside the family. That William's grief had never fully separated itself from a specific set of unanswered questions about what happened to his mother and why. And that at some point, in some form, those questions were going to demand a response that went beyond the careful managed acknowledgments the palace had offered over the years. He had hoped, sources suggest, that the moment of that reckoning was further away, that it would come, if it came at all, after his own reign had concluded, that William would wait until he was king before using the institutional authority available to him to address the Diana legacy in the most direct and documented way available. He had not anticipated Anne. Her decision to join William in the submission was, by all accounts, the element that surprised Charles most. Because Anne's involvement transforms the submission from something that could be characterized, however unfairly, as a son's emotional response to his mother's memory, into something considerably more significant. It makes it a considered, jointly executed, institutionally grounded action by two of the most senior and most credible members of the royal family. And it makes any attempt by Charles to characterize it as premature or inappropriate considerably harder to sustain. Camilla, who understands better than most how the internal dynamics of this family operate, recognized immediately what Anne's involvement meant. It meant that the submission had been discussed, planned, and agreed upon by William and Anne over a period of time, that it was not impulsive, that it had been prepared with the full awareness of its implications, and that the two people most directly connected to Diana's legacy inside the current royal family had decided, together and deliberately, that the time for the kind of careful institutional silence that had protected certain things for nearly 30 years had passed. She reportedly said very little when her legal advisor presented the full assessment of the situation to her. Those present describe a woman who sat with the information for a long moment before speaking. And when she did speak, what she said was not about legal strategy or communications management or the specific challenges her team had identified. She asked a single question. She asked whether Charles had known in advance that William and Anne were going to file the submission. The answer her advisor gave her was that there was no evidence he had been consulted before it was filed, that the submission appeared to have been prepared and submitted without prior notification to the king. Camilla absorbed that answer in silence. And those present say that what settled over her in that moment was not anger. It was something quieter and more unsettling than anger. It was the recognition that the two people closest to Diana's memory inside the royal family had made a major institutional move without telling Charles first, and that whatever that said about their relationship with the king, it said something even more significant about their relationship with her. What it says about the future of the monarchy and the long-term consequences of what Anne and William have set in motion is the final and most consequential piece of this story. What this signals for the monarchy. Going forward, pull back from the immediate details of what Anne and William have done and look at the broader picture. Because the submission to the Royal Household Trust Authority is not simply a legal and institutional action with consequences for the specific individuals most directly affected by it, it is a signal. A clear, deliberate, and carefully constructed signal about the direction the British monarchy is heading and the values that will define it when the next generation takes full control. To understand the full weight of that signal, you have to understand something about the way institutions manage their own histories. Every institution that has survived across generations has developed mechanisms for controlling the narrative of its past, for deciding which chapters of its history are made accessible, and which are kept sealed. For determining whose account of events becomes the official record and whose remains private, disputed, or simply unavailable, the British monarchy has been exceptionally skilled at this kind of historical management. It has maintained, across centuries, a careful balance between the transparency required to sustain public trust and the opacity required to protect the people and decisions that public trust might not survive knowing about in full. That balance has been calibrated and recalibrated across generations, and it has, on the whole, served the institution's survival interests reasonably well. But William does not believe that balance is sustainable in its current form. And what he and Anne have done in February 2026 is the most visible expression yet of a fundamentally different approach to the relationship between the monarchy and its own history. His position, as those close to him describe it, is not that the institution should abandon all protection of sensitive historical material. He understands the legitimate reasons for some degree of discretion around the most private aspects of royal life. What he does not accept is the use of institutional mechanisms to suppress documented evidence of decisions that caused serious harm to individuals inside the family, and that the public has a legitimate interest in understanding. Diana's story falls squarely into that second category in his assessment, and the submission he has filed with Anne is the institutional expression of that assessment. It says, in the formal language of procedural submission, that the documented record of what happened to Diana inside the royal family between 1985 and 1997 belongs to history, that it should be preserved, reviewed, and released in a controlled form that allows the public to understand what that record contains, and that the palace's decades-long management of that record, in the interests of protecting specific individuals from accountability, is no longer consistent with the kind of institution William intends to lead. That position has consequences that extend well beyond Camilla's immediate situation. It has consequences for how the monarchy approaches the management of sensitive historical material going forward. It has consequences for the courtiers and advisors who have spent careers operating within the old framework of careful suppression. And it has consequences for the public understanding of the institution in ways that are difficult to fully predict, but impossible to ignore. For Camilla, the long-term consequences are the most immediately personal and the most immediately significant. What the review process set in motion by Anne and William's submission will ultimately produce depends on findings that are not yet complete. The Royal Household Trust Authority operates on its own timeline. The review of the materials requested will take months. The determination of what can be released, in what form, and with what contextual framing is a complex process that involves legal assessment, historical expertise, and institutional judgment. But the process itself, regardless of its eventual outcome, has already changed Camilla's position in ways that cannot be reversed. It has placed on the formal institutional record a joint determination by William and Anne that the Diana correspondence is material of sufficient historical and public significance to warrant formal review and controlled release. That determination stands regardless of what the review ultimately produces, and it sends a message to everyone inside and outside the palace about how the next generation of royal leadership views the Diana legacy and the institutional decisions connected to it. For Camilla, that message is unambiguous. The careful distance she has maintained from the Diana question throughout her years as a royal, the deliberate policy of never directly addressing Diana's experience, or the role her relationship with Charles played in shaping it, that distance is no longer sufficient protection against what is now a formally initiated institutional process. She cannot simply wait for the story to move on. The story is not moving on, it is moving forward, into an institutional review process that she cannot control, cannot halt, and cannot shape in the way she has been able to shape so much of the public narrative around her position over the past 2 decades. For the monarchy itself, what Anne and William have initiated represents something genuinely significant in the long arc of the institution's relationship with its own history. The decision to formally seek the review and controlled release of sensitive historical correspondence about one of the most painful chapters in the family's recent past is not a decision that could have been made from a position of weakness or uncertainty. It is a decision that reflects confidence. Confidence that the institution is strong enough to absorb the full documented record of what happened to Diana. Confidence that transparency, however uncomfortable in the short term, serves the monarchy's long-term credibility better than continued suppression. And confidence that the public, whose consent the institution ultimately depends upon, is capable of receiving that record and making its own informed assessment of what it contains. That confidence is itself a statement about where the monarchy is heading. An institution that trusts the public with its most difficult historical truths is an institution that has made a fundamental decision about the relationship it wants to have with the people it serves. And that decision reflects William's vision for the crown more completely than almost anything else he has done since stepping into his current position. Princess Anne's role in all of this cannot be overstated. She did not simply add her name to a document William had prepared. She brought to the submission her own decades of institutional knowledge, her own carefully formed assessment of the Diana years, and her own considerable credibility as the most consistently trusted and respected senior royal of her generation. Her involvement transformed the submission from a significant action into a historic one, and it sent a signal about the alignment between the current generation and the next that the palace has not seen expressed this clearly or this formally before. The consequences for everyone connected to this story will continue to develop over the months ahead as the review process moves forward. But certain things are already settled. The submission has been filed. The process has been initiated. The documented record of Diana's years inside the royal family is now under formal institutional review by a body with the authority to release it. And Camilla, who has spent 20 years building a position inside the institution that Diana's suffering helped to define, is now waiting to find out what that record says about the years she has never fully accounted for, in a process initiated by the son of the woman she helped to hurt, and the sister-in-law who watched it all happen from inside the family and never forgot what she saw. Some things, it turns out, cannot be suppressed indefinitely, not when the people with the institutional authority to unseal them have finally decided that the time for suppression has passed. Anne and William did not raise their voices. They filed a document. They followed every procedure. They built a case that the institution could not dismiss. Diana never got justice from the palace that failed her. But the record of what happened to her is finally being opened. And that changes everything.